I want to start. So I usually go on native-land.ca to kind of like check my facts. So as I build land acknowledgement, and I was surprised to find that on their platform currently they have an AI helper, and so I was just like, oh, I'm curious about this. What is this AI helper Correro going to do? I'm a little weary of AI because it's so new for us and there are problems that haven't been addressed, I think, in my from my perspective. Anyways, I engaged with it and it was really interesting. There were some really hard questions that it was asking of me, like what is my commitment to the land that I'm on? You can put in like where you're located, and then it kind of takes you to the map that they have created. And from these questions, it sort of created a land acknowledgement for me, which I've adapted, and I'm gonna just like read it because I thought it was really interesting what it came up with. So as I walk through the parks around my neighborhood, such as the Corktown Commons and Birasige Park of Cherry Street, I am called to reduce my impact on these places and learn the original names of the land to build a relationship with territories that are the ancestral homelands of many nations, including the Anishinaabe, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I intend to find and support local Indigenous organizations such as Anishinaabe Health, which recently relocated to Cherry Street, to honor Indigenous peoples' enduring connection and responsibility to these lands and waters, a responsibility that I also share as a guest on these territories. I want my actions to be guided by humility, respect, and a growing sense of kinship with all our relations. I really appreciated the words that it offered me because sometimes it's really hard to come up with things to say to personalize a land acknowledgement. And a lot of these thoughts came from things that I was telling Correro, like I really like going to the park. So I sort of built that into this. So I just offer that as a resource for those who are attending in case you're curious like me and want to also strive to do better. And I really like that at the end of it, it had like, this is not an end, this is the beginning. And so this is how I see land acknowledgements as a beginning to commitment, and to gratitude, which is where I'm going next. Like, I want to express gratitude for being able to work and live here in Toronto, to be able to drink water that is less polluted than other places. I'm grateful for a body that is really sensitive and that allows me that tells me actually when I've pushed it too far and tells me to back off. I'm grateful to the season. It's taken me a long time to get used to the fall, and as we're transitioning into winter, which already came, I feel a little bit more settled for the cold. I love the warmth, so I always miss summer, but today I was feeling really grateful for the slowing down that comes with the fall and the winter. And I'm really grateful to be having a conversation with Miggy, who is a friend and colleague, a PhD candidate in the Department of Social Justice Education, and a dance artist and educator. I'm so glad that you're here, Miggy, because we've had lots of conversations, and I love that we're usually on the same, if not always on the same wavelength on things. So I'm so happy and honored to be able to talk with you. How are
Yeah.
you? How are you
Thanks for having
doing?
me. I'm doing okay. I'm doing okay. Actually, as a dance artist, movement artist, somatic practice practitioner, I kind of can we take a breath? Because I think it's one thing that I always like to start my practice in. Also navigating experiences through madness like anxiety. Um, Breath is tenuous, but also calming. So yeah, I want to take a breath.
Let's do it. Yes.
All right. Just taking a breath together in and out. And also, for me, breath is not it's a presencing act, but not in like the ways in which like in a lot of mainstream normative dance spaces we're expected to like be present by leaving everything at the door. I think of breath more as that the invitation to inhale and bring in everything that we're bringing into the space and navigate how we're exhaling it into our present being, honoring how we're coming to the space, not trying to change it, but just trying to um, work through it all.
I love that. Yes, honoring ourselves through
Yeah.
breath. I want to start our conversation with just a really broad question. Like, can you tell me about your PhD research, what it's about in today?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, Sebastian and I have talked about this often where, I'm in the midst of the dissertation writing part, so everything is scattered and kind of everywhere and nowhere at the same time as I'm working through it all. Um, I'll begin by just, again, thinking of breath, thinking of what I'm inhaling into the space today and sharing with you and presencing here. A lot of my work is oriented through disability arts practice and disability justice orientations. And so bringing to the space that in disability justice community, we're navigating the transition of disability justice activist Alice Wong, who passed away recently, who's been a big influence on many of us. And I just want to share a quote actually that kind of gestures to what I'm thinking through a lot in my work. In her memoir called Year of the Tiger, An Activist's Life, she writes, quote, "When something can't be fixed, then the question is, what can we build instead?" End quote. Um, and for me, I bring that in and it helps me think through how a lot of my work is engaging through an abolitionist politics. Um, I engage with Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's an abolitionist scholar, who says, quote, "Abolition is fleshly and material presence of social life lived differently," end quote. And so again, bringing in the question of the messes that we're in, how do we keep imagining otherwise? And that's kind of what politically motivates my work. But to introduce like what I'm thinking through and what my project is, I'm gonna start with sharing a story that kind of inspires the work. Again, talking about inspiration, what gets me going in this work. It's a story of being as you introduced me. I am a dance educator and artist. Have been an elementary school educator as well, and been doing a lot of work teaching workshops in elementary schools, dance workshops, creative dance workshops. And I was invited one time to a what's called a congregated site, which is a school that's for um, it's labeled as a special education school. So even with integration of disabled students, there's still certain disabled students who are not deemed inclusion to be able to be included in mainstream schools. So there are congregated sites. And I was invited to come into a classroom to teach a creative dance workshop. And so to start off, I wanted to just do a mirroring activity just to bring in and engage with relationship building between students, myself, the adults. It was a one-to-one ratio of teachers or educational assistants to students. The students I was working with uh, under the school were labeled as developmentally disabled, wheelchair users, nonverbal. These are kind of the language used to describe them, especially when I came into school to make sure I knew what I was coming into. Um, I decided to do that mirroring activity just to start to explore how we might begin sharing movement. And so I invited the prompt of we're just going to become each other's mirrors and follow each other and explore how we can find moments of sharing movement together. And an educational assistant said, but they aren't doing anything. And so that suggestion of, first of all, that a student could be conceived of as not doing creative dance is one thing that kind of made me pause and kind of made me just feel disquiet. But also, moreover, that a student can be deemed as not doing anything. And specifically, um, I have been really thinking through how that can be said through an understanding of disability in relationship to not doing, and what we conceive as not doing, and in relationship to dance, not dancing. And so that's kind of what um, animates my dissertation project, where I'm kind of exploring how we come to understand the dancing body through imaginaries of disability. Um, and one of the big things is within within a lot of schooling spaces, and dance schooling spaces, disability tends to disappear. So, for example, in the arts curriculum, elementary school curriculum in Ontario, the word disability doesn't appear at all. Also, when I'm in the classroom, uh, usually disability doesn't appear either in language used, like words like special education or differently abled are kind of the language used. And so disability actually is made to disappear. And at the same time, in its disappearance, an understanding of it, of disability is made to appear as not fitting within our conception of student, the normal student, in the dance classroom with our conception of dancing. And so I've been really interested in thinking through how the disappearance of disability in language, in words, in expectations also reveals an appearance of how we're imagining disability in the first place, um, and what fit, and through our conception of what fits. And so I've engaged in my research project engages with a lot of artifacts, curricular artifacts, and encounters with like when disability is kind of made to appear through its disappearance. But also one way in which it really appears is through the language of inclusion. So I've been really engaging with artifacts of, for example, modules for best practices for including diverse dancers, quote unquote, um, as a way to understand how um, disability is being made to appear. And the thing I'm navigating is that response to exclusions of disability or the disappearance of disability through this move towards inclusion. Um, I've been engaging that critically because a lot of times I find that um, when we think about the language of inclusion or acts of inclusion, um, there's kind of not a questioning of what we're being included into. And so thinking through the ways in which a lot of inclusionary practices actually end up reinforcing the exclusion of disabilities' creative possibility, critical possibility to think differently. And so that's where, towards the end of my project, I'm kind of also engaging with disability arts practices of how we might rethink what it means to engage with and through disability, disabled embodiment, to rethink what it means to teach and learn dance.
Wow, so much rich, like fertile ground there for for thought. I have so many questions already. Something that came up as you were talking is this is something that you mentioned in your biography that rest and unrest, at rest or unrest. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that, this sort of doing, not doing, like because it kind of reminded me of that. And then I also wanted to think about the term disability and why, there's I feel like I know of two, and there's probably more lines of thought where around disability as an identity and whether you put that identity first. So I am a disabled person, or after I'm a person with a disability. And so I was wondering if you could talk about those two things, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, I'll start with the last one and then go. I'll start with language first. So yeah, in a lot of like especially in educational spaces, a lot of like inclusionary language has moved and best quote unquote best practices of inclusion have moved towards what's called person first language. And I want to also name how the person first language came a lot from parent advocates for their children or adults, caregivers advocating for disabled children more so. And so the idea of person first, that you're a person first, and then disability is kind of doesn't is there, but not the most important part about you. Whereas there's a move within disability rights and disability justice spaces to actually say, no, 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 disability is part of my selfhood, is part of my identity. So to use identity first language, disabled person instead of person with disability. And moreover, that also is a space of engaging disability as a political identity, but also as a cultural identity. So understanding it as, again, a rich source of culture and creativity. And that's not to say that there's consensus. Everyone chooses however they want to identify as. Um, and the traditions I'm engaging with, the communities I'm engaging with, kind of are working to challenge the notion that we can understand personhood, or that challenge the expectation that to achieve personhood, disability has to be removed, and actually trying to center disability as an integral part of our being and our way of knowing. And in art spaces, part of the creativity, part of the process um, of what we do. And then going back to your first question, can you remind me what the first one you said was?
Yeah, if you could talk about rest and unrest.
Thank you. So yeah, so as I was saying, kind of the story that begins my dissertation, thinking of this moment of uh, identifying or a student being identified as not doing something, I started to think about the ways in which like a teacher's task and a learner's task is to constantly assess ourselves and how assessment kind of gets focused on this idea of doing versus not doing, and how there are narratives of disability and productivity that come into play there. And so the idea that for a disabled person to be included into, for example, dance education, we must find a way to make sense of them as doing dance, but there's not a challenging of what it means to do dance, or even like the capitalist productivity of doing dance, or the capitalist expectation of what it means to do dance. And so I'm kind of engaging with those moments of identifying not doings as sites to kind of challenge the binary of doing versus not doing, and what kinds of narratives kind of shape that conception of doing versus not doing, which goes into ideas of like, again, productivity, but also worth and value and what's valued. Um, and so part of that kind of towards the end of education, I engage with disability arts practices to think through doing and not doing, particularly through my own practice as I start to relearn and unlearn my dance practices. And so I actually engage with kind of going to gestures of madness and navigating my experiences of those as creative sites for exploring this tension between doing and not doing, exploring the ways in which like a lot of mad movements are deemed as a not doing of rational movement, and in a lot of like Western theories of gesture, for example, that means it's not gesture, it's not meaningful because it's not coming from a space of agency, for example, or reasonableness. And so and then I've been thinking of like rest as one of those gestures of care, um, and how and I explore rest through stillness, and how like stillness can be seen as a not doing of movement and this not doing of dance. Um, and so I've been kind of exploring what it might mean to return to those mad doings that are deemed as not doings, to explore what creative possibility is there, to think differently. And one thing I think through, especially when it comes to mad experiences of rest, is that there's so much unrest in there as well. It's like you can't kind of separate the rest. Like the idea that I always share, I have no idea what it means to rest, even though a lot of my creative practice right now is exploring gestures of rest. Because it's the question of like, how do we rest amidst the anxieties of the world, ongoing climate catastrophe, um, the attacks on queer, trans, disabled, crip, mad life, um, continued resonances of settler colonialism, imperialism, genocide. Just like how do we navigate rest? And so I'm kind of grappling with how, in relationship to rest, is always this like unrest, and then turning to that as a political possibility, a creative political possibility, a creative abolitionist possibility of what might it mean to actually tune into the unrest register of rest as a way of like seeking rest as a creative space for thinking otherwise. The idea that I need to rest because this is not okay. Um, yeah, so it goes back to again that idea of like what might I return to what's understood as not doing, um, in our capitalist productive kind of sociality. How might that be actually a really, really, really creative gesture towards something otherwise? Um, yeah.
Thank you for that. I feel like it's reminding me of Trisha Hersey's Restless Resistance, and one of the things that she mentions is rest can also be work. So sometimes, like it just brought up memories of me going to take a nap because I'm just so tired, and having to because I'm also so caught up in this productivity as well. It's hard to let go of that. But so I tell myself, I'm like, I am doing work right now. By having a nap, I am doing work. And it sort of allows me in this moment as I try to find rest, right? To calm down and to allow myself to take that time for myself as part of the other work that I'm doing, the work that is not napping. I don't see that as the end, of course. I see that as a beginning to be able to move into finding rest and peace in rest. But I also like what you're saying around what does it mean to find rest in these unrestful times, in these or moments of unrest, right? Like, what does that call us to pay attention to? What does that make us be grateful for or get mad about, about when so much is happening in the world and it's really hard to contend, and sometimes it's hard to find rest within those moments. Um, I also really appreciate that you're opening up what doing means. Um, yes, so thank you for that. Out of curiosity, what has been like the most urgent insight that has come up for you through this research process?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work I've been exploring has been like um, also very narrative based in the sense of like trying to pursue the narratives that kind of choreograph our conceptions and meaning and our movement through these meanings of doing and not doing. And so one specific narrative I've been really grappling with is the ways in which like the association of a not doing is not merely just to like discredit or disvalue, but also like has elements of well, it kind of gestures to the elements of the expectations that a teacher takes on the role of policing students' movement, the ways in which like a not doing becomes made pathological or deviant or criminal, often in very subtle ways, but also in very, very real ways, especially for disabled and racialized students. Um, for example, one artifact I'm engaging with is actually the first appearance of dance, creative dance in Ontario elementary curriculum, which was actually in the physical education curriculum. And it was in that physical education curriculum, there's kind of like a warm-up activity as a sample where it's inviting teachers to just introduce moving through space with students, um, all under the language of classroom management. And so even the idea of like, the teacher now becomes manager. But it was like, so having students walk around the space, and then when the teacher blew a whistle, everyone froze. Um, many dance teachers might know this kind of activity, or like PE teachers might recognize this idea of like we're practicing. It's even akin to freeze dance, for example, where you're dancing through space, music stops, everyone freezes, like a signal for everyone to freeze, just to practice. Again, it's like a classroom management tool. But in this curriculum, there was the metaphor given of the teacher, or the teacher can describe how like blowing the whistle, like you're a police officer, and how everyone freezes to listen to the police officer. And so already their language of policing as a mundane, ordinary narrative that actually dictates what it means to be managed in the classroom, what it means to be valued as doing the right thing, assessed as doing the right thing, as and so even there already, just like that framing, I've been really exploring the ways in which, like, again, there is a there's really there's really consequential conceptions of students who are deemed as not doing, um, and so. And so that's why also it connects more against an abolitionist perspective for me, where it's like really thinking, relating differently to how we understand ourselves, our bodies, our relations within teaching learning spaces.
This policing of bodies through these, metaphors, like if I was a police officer, like listen to the whistle. I think you've also mentioned before, like this is also tied up with the policing of creativity. Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's an element where I think about the ways in which it becomes a there's also a fixing of what it means to understand creativity. And I find that like engaging with policing as well and like narratives of policing also allows me to connect now to like white supremacist conceptions of what it means to understand creativity, the ways in which like even how creativity requires you, or a lot of like elementary school dance, creative dance comes from Laban notions of understanding the body, and I've been really tuning into how he phrases it as a form of mastery, or how he phrases his like way of understanding different elements as a mastery of movement, and even that idea of mastery, how there that has resonance of like white supremacist resonances to it, the idea that we have to have full control of our bodies, the idea that that's the ideal of like creative genius is to have full control of the body. Um, and then I think of the ways in which um, just our normative imaginaries of what dance are and what the human is uh, are really connected to the idea of like control from a supremacist standpoint. The idea that there's only one form of the body that is controlling in a way that we want it to be, and that controlling is meant to actually remove the excesses of any other kind of movement. It's actually to uphold a certain ideal body. Um, and I think about it, and I've been thinking that a lot about like in relationship to how we conceive of human. So um, Sylvia Wynter talks about the idea that uh, we mistake a certain genre of human for the human itself. So like there are many ways of being human, there are many genres of human, and yet we mistake one specific genre, bioeconomic, white, heteropatriarchal man, as the human. And so everything else is done in relation to that, as opposed to recognizing that's just one genre of human. And it's a super, and that's the supremacist aspect of it. So I think about within dance spaces how there's also a supremacist aspect of how we understand our body through this idea of mastering it. And I think that comes through like the ways in which like when I come to a dance classroom, a lot of times the first thing students think of as ballet, right? Is the first thing they think of as the again, a genre of dance that gets mistaken for dance itself. Um, and then how that shapes everything. So one of the artifacts I actually engage in as well is a resource that's created by the National Ballet as a teaching resource for teachers to provide best, quote unquote, best practices for inclusive dance. Um, and so it's really interesting because it doesn't engage ballet at all, and still in the background, there you can see images of the anatomy of an ideal dancer. Even there's one activity called Pose Master. Again, mastery being part of there, where students are invited to take uh, a shadow, like a whiteboard with like magnetic figure of a shadow human, and they get to make a pose, and everyone imitates the pose in their body. But if you look at the anatomy of that shadow figure, it has a beautifully perfect ballet turnout, has wonderfully arched feet, has a long extension to the arms. So already the creativity of otherwise is always has to be included and shaped through a normative ideal body.
What's bringing to mind is, that I think it's Tim Engel does a sort of history of walking, and what he uh, says in the article, I can't remember what it's called at the moment, but he talks about how this idea of the ideal gait really emerged out of a militaristic understanding of walking and marching, and so you get this understanding of how people should walk and or master walking from a militaristic standpoint. And I find that really interesting because it sort of trickles into our quotidian lives in ways that we assume normalcy as something that is natural, and actually it's not at all. It's something that's been taught, and that we've had to conform to. Um, it also brings to mind this a personal like story. I was looking through my personal archives. That my parents brought from Chile, and I found a booklet of stuff that I had to do when I was young. So it's like shapes and numbers and stuff. And one of the instructions was like I had to co copy the number one in a specific way, but also with a specific color. And my ones were all different colors. And so I got like the teacher wrote like, no, it has to be one color. And you saw that happen a couple times with like two. And then I think by the time I got to the number three, they were all one color. So it was a process of sort of, policing this creativity into something that, into fitting into the instruction, right? Without actually, yeah, anyways, it just brought up these things. And we don't know sometimes where these instructions come from, right? I think that that's sort of like what came up for me when you're talking about this idea of inclusivity being proposed by the National Ballet. Like, If that is in the background and that's not foregrounded, then we forget that the instruction came from a very specific dance form, not from an inclusive perspective to begin with.
Yeah, I mean, what I'll say is, and I think that's where also like one of the things I'm very critical about is like moves towards the idea of like the answer to exclusion is inclusion, but like inclusion itself still maintains the system and structure that requires the exclusion of other. Education is a great example of this. For example, I'll use your example of like the policing of creativity, where the numbers that are multicolored become regimented into one color. An answer for inclusion, or inclusionary best practice, quote unquote, could be to say, no, no, let's let them use any color they want to bring back that creativity. And still, what's not being questioned is the idea, the very foundational like idea of numeracy, or the idea that we're learning these numbers as like an integral part of education. Like, that's the most important thing that we learn, right? That's foundational to again, and doesn't it doesn't make it allow us to be critical of like how that comes from a Victorian era conception of education, where it's like the three R's: arithmetic, reading, and writing, right? Because it's creating a managerial class. So it's not challenging the very structure and goals of education. Um, Again, one thing that's really interesting is within arts educational spaces, there's a big move a really important one to advocate for the inclusion of arts by finding ways to make it cross-curricular. So the idea of like, oh, dance is can be helpful for sciences. So let's create like lesson plans and ideas where dance can be instrumental or can be a way to engage sciences, for example, or math. Um, but what that move of inclusion doesn't do is challenge why is it that math and sciences are the core of schooling and dance is not, and arts are not important um, aspects of what we learn, right? Um, so one of the things, and this is why, again, for me, um, I engage in abolitionist politics is because it's really about what does it mean to do otherwise? What does it mean to continue to pursue um, the dismantling and destruction of the structures we have in service of creating something else. Because I think one of the things that a lot of times when we talk about abolition, people get caught up in is like oh, but if you get rid of it, then you'll have nothing. It's like that's why abolition is a creative process. Like abolition is literally the creating of a different society, sociality, different worlds, which would require us to dismantle the oppressive policing carceral structures that we have to imagine otherwise. And I guess that's where it also transitions to my where I turn to with all this is turning towards disability and mad arts practices as a way of thinking otherwise, and I'm particularly tuning into um, practices that challenge these normative conceptions of inclusion and are actually getting back to the like actually challenging the foundation of what we think when we understand our bodies as we teach and learn dance practices. Yeah, and so it helps me think through, and I've been thinking a lot through access as a very critical and creative practice um, to think through that.
Can you talk about more? Can you talk more about access, like what you're tuning into there?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, when I engage with access as this critical and creative provocation, um, it's less about the idea of how do we include disabled, mad, neurodivergent, deaf folks into the spaces that are already there, and more so the idea of like if we're actually imagining diverse bodies and minds coming into a space, how do we actually create the space that can allow us to all be together? So it's less about like, when I think of access in this critical creative space, I think of it from the beginning of creative process. So it's like the idea of how do we begin thinking of who do we want to be in the space, not the idea how access and accommodations usually are come at the end afterwards. The idea of like we have this educational structure, we have this performance structure, and now we have these students who don't fit into our normative conception of who's here. So let's figure out how to fit them in. It's more so actually getting the folks who don't fit, the misfits, is a term that's used a lot in disability studies, misfitting. And how do you actually start from the misfitting as a way to rethink the structures and systems that we're in, the spaces we're creating, the practices we're engaging in? I also think of it through a Black studies engagement with fugitivity. So in Black studies, fugitivity is an engagement with the ways in which Blackness um, has always been made criminal, And so to find freedom requires flight and escape. So fugitivity, the idea of escaping, like literally the fugitive slave, right? It's coming from that history and that lineage of what does it mean to understand your being as always being fugitive because you're being made criminal, because you're being made deviant, because you're always having to escape. And so I think of that in relationship to disability, of um, how do we access like the fugitive registers of disability and madness, the ways in which like there's always a need to escape because it's disability and madness are always being fixed or being made criminal or being made deviant. And it's very and this relationship between blackness and disability and madness is very purposeful because of the ways in which conceptions of race and disability kind of come together and are imbricated, and how disability language and rhetoric is used to legitimize racism, and how racial ways of thinking and knowing are used to legitimize ableism. So understanding how the two kind of come together in an in the possibility of thinking otherwise. Um, a lot of my work is also engaged with mad studies, and in mad studies is actually comes from a political movement that's not within the university, but actually coming from abolitionist um, mad people's movements by psych survivors and users. Fighting against the incarceration and the institutionalization of mad folks. So again, this idea that there is a very abolitionist move towards creating something beyond the kind of structures we have that continue to police us, that continue to confine us in a single way of doing things.
And again, this ties really like this is so connected to ideas of mastery, which I think is what we, as we become fugitives, we're trying to move away from. Can you talk more about one, what that means to you, and two, like who's inspiring your thoughts around, yeah, this idea of mastering the body and moving away from that?
I mean, as I reflect on my own dance practice and thinking about how I create, um, it becomes that moment of kind of, I'm really trying to pursue now um, the moments of slipping, the moments of excess, the moments where my body can't do the thing I imagine it to do, and that being a space of radical compassion and a creative space of radical compassion to think otherwise. So this concept of radical compassion actually comes from um, Black studies scholar Lamar Jarrell Bruce, who wrote a book, How to Go Mad Without Losing Your Mind, talking about Black radical creativity, um, Black feminist radical creativity, and the idea of like, what does it mean to have compassion for those who don't fit into our conception of what's normal? The mad person, the queer person, um, the person who's ranting and raving, the unreasonable person. And so for me, I'm kind of pursuing the moments of slipping. In normative dance training, um, we actually, I've come to realize we actually recognize that we're always failing to achieve the ideal because we have to repeat. Like the pursuit of mastery requires a repetition, because we know that our bodies can't do it. And so for me, I'm actually interested in this repetition as a moment to pursue the errant pathways towards otherwise. Again, what happens when your body can't do the thing that you expect it to do? And how does that offer us a different pathway to a different choreography, a different score of movement that we can explore? Um, so yeah, it's for me, there's a lot of this opportunity to engage those moments where we don't fit as that moment of like, oh, and this is a possible alterity. This is a possible other imagination of what we can do together. And influencing me are really just like my dance comrades, like a lot of disabled dance artists I'm working with. In Toronto, I'm thinking of Shea Ehrlich. I'm thinking of Cass Preuss. I'm thinking of Courage Bacchus. Those are just people come top of my head. But I'm thinking of all these folks who are engaging disability as that site of rethinking what it means to creatively move their bodies and really radically doing that. So not to try and conform to what is, but really trying to reimagine what does it mean for what we ask for when we produce a piece? What does that, how does that change even the budget, for example, when we create production? That changes everything. Not trying to do an add-on or trying to be like, and now we're including disability, but like, how does disability from the beginning challenge everything?
That is so important. It's making me think about a term that I came up with for myself at one point when my disability was no longer invisible when it became too much to hide. And it made me realize that I had been performing ability this whole time to fit in, to not be perceived in a particular way. And it really asked me to, like, when that came to mind, it really provoked me to confront, why I was hiding and why I wanted to fit. And so in reflecting, I started to think about, yeah, these errant pathways to do otherwise. And part of that was like honoring myself, right? And just recognizing, no, I don't have to do this. Like, my body doesn't want to, so no, I can't. And no, I don't want to. Um, so it's making me think about that. I love that this point of misfitting as a starting point. Yeah, because if we begin from that position of no, I don't fit, then we are immediately, I feel like, or for myself, I immediately called to think of what else I can do, right? And I think that that's what you're talking about. That otherwise is like, what else can we do here? Um, the moments of slipping. Yeah, I love that. Thank you for seeing all that stuff. Yeah, is there anything else you want to add about mastery? Because this topic is super interesting to me because I feel like in dance we are always trying to master our bodies, if not the dance form. Well, no, master our bodies and the dance form. So it's this double sort of mastery that occurs, which creates a double slave of us. And I'm thinking here with Julietta Singh's, I'm thinking mastery. So I was wondering if you had any other thoughts around that.
Yeah, I think it's actually answering a question before as well of how it's helping me think through things also is like in the face of mastery. Um, I've been really thinking about like what it means to return back to rehearsal, because so much of mastery again is the idea of product, the idea that we're mastering in service of a product. And so I think about what might it mean to return back to rehearsal. I'm again gesturing to an abolitionist idea of like rehearsal because like we're rehearsing otherwise constantly. And so what does it mean to turn to back to process as opposed to product? What does it mean for us to understand the teaching and learning of creative dance as focusing on process because it's the creation part, which is the process of it all. Um, and so, what might it mean to center rehearsal over performance, or to understand performance as a version or as a version of rehearsal, or a genre of rehearsal even. Um, and so, in turning to rehearsal, I've been thinking through more about like how things like assessment become less about um, comparing to a standard or identifying a doing or not doing, but actually just asking the reflective question of like, what are we creating? What are we doing? Understanding how our body is moving. Um, More about understanding and less about like categorizing or determining what's being done. Um, and so, and then I think of like, because that's why also as a dance artist, that's my favorite parts are rehearsal. When I teach dance or I choreograph pieces, I always tell the folks I'm working with, like, it's never going to be as magical as it is in rehearsal. The performance will never, there'll always be that wonderful moment in rehearsal that you can never do again on stage. And so I really love um, returning to rehearsal. And it allows us, I think the biggest thing within like disability mad arts, it allows us to also just then like have again radical compassion for ourselves and care for ourselves and work within and um, use the resources we get to create. Because a lot of times, and I say this a lot when I'm talking to producers who want to work with disabled artists, a lot of times there's an expectation of like, okay, you're going to be in here and you're going to keep you the same standards of you must do this, this, and this. And sometimes, like, when I'm with disability arts community, we spend like a whole first rehearsal just talking about how are we doing? What do we need? This space is awful. We can't work here. What do we need to bring in? And it doesn't look like we're doing anything in the terms of like creating dance, for example. And a lot of times we have to advocate to producers or funders that like, no, 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 this is the creative process. And so I've been thinking about how it is like asking questions about ourselves in relation with each other, in relationship to space. How much more choreographic can you get? Like that is choreography, right? That is thinking choreographically. It's just doing it differently. And so I've been really thinking about like, what does it mean? to return to those creative process, return to that as part of the creative process, and how that's not about mastery. That's about understanding each other in relations. That's about shaping the space in a way that can support us.
Yeah, thank you. It brings me to like how a lot of uh, newer dance artists and choreographers do take a lot of time, do take time to have conversations, prior to beginning to choreograph, and how that is so important for not only creating trust, between the dancers and the choreographer and the group, just the group in general, but also for building a relationship with each other and the space. And I love that you're bringing space into this, space, bodies, land, like all of this is sort of connected. Um, because it's so important to understand who we are in these moments, you know, before we get to the moving together. Yeah, as a way to move together through the space, I think that's really important. It brought to mind, this, I don't know how I became such a rule follower, but I did at some point. And it made me think about this dutifulness, that has been such a big part of my practice and being, and how a lot of my doing is a duty to rules. And so you're making me think about, the rules as something that I personally need to challenge, for myself as a way to, I don't know, maybe not move in those directions. So that came up for me. Um, and I think that that's really important because for myself, I do get stuck in rules a lot. And one of those stories that I grew up hearing was around creating a product. That was the rule of choreographing is you create a product and it has to be, look a certain way and crystallize in a certain way. But as I learned more and saw other people choreograph, I started to realize that that was just an illusion, that I had inadvertently taken in something that wasn't actually true, that many people work towards a coalescing, so a lot of the rehearsals become coalesced in what they present on stage at one single point, and then they continue to depart from that. And so I really like this idea of performance as a genre of rehearsal because it made me think of that the product, it's not the final thing. It's actually a landmark along a longer journey. And I think that that's what you're pointing towards.
And I think there's an element too where when you talk about like being schooled into being a rule follower, that's where also fugitivity is a really interesting thing to think through, like the ways in which you're like the things that you're not doing, like the ways like for me, a lot of the process is actually pursuing the ways, but even when when we're trying to follow the rules, we actually don't. And how does that lead to something else, right? Because usually what we do is we tend to mark that as the excess, and then we actually then pursue the rule. We realize that, oh, that was my momentary failure to follow the rule, and now I'm going to put that aside, and it's okay. I have compassion for myself, and I'm going to follow the rule, as opposed to what might it mean to actually pursue the moments of breakage, um, and how that becomes a really really creative space to something else.
Yeah, it feels creative and it feels scary. And I think for me, it feels scary because I have been so directed and orientated to go in that direction of like, this is the thing that you should follow. Um, but I also know and have experienced firsthand how it can be so creative to slip away from that and to do the other thing, right? To fail, which can be such a scary thing in this society where you're told that failure is bad and deviant, even criminal. Thank you for that. Is there anything else that you want to add or discuss before we close off? Because we're almost at the hour. It's gone by so fast.
It really has. I mean, yeah, I think for me, the one thing that I'm really holding on to is just like, there's within abolitionist scholarship and activism, there's that notion of like abolition is about changing everything. And I think that's like what I keep going towards. And that can be a very daunting kind of provocation. The idea that the world is like destroyed, we have to change everything, is not working. We have to change everything. But then maybe this is going back to Alice Wong's suggestion of when something can't be fixed, then the question is what can we build instead? And so for me, I think disability in mad arts for me is like that has as a teacher for me, because I'm thinking about how this whole project and engaging further with disability in my community has taught me so much about my own dance practices differently, is like how can we keep pursuing that building of otherwise, and not and always being unsatisfied with the what is. I've been thinking through this a lot with colleagues and comrades of like my goal in my work is to provoke others to go beyond what I could even imagine because I'm also limited in my imaginary based on the ways in which I've been schooled. And so how can I offer again a portal to another pathway that someone might take up and be like, Mickey, you're too much in the norm. I I'm going beyond you. And that's my honestly that's what I've been thinking through a lot. As a way again to engage with rehearsal also as an intergenerational project. The idea that opening up to when people challenge you as well, when others challenge you as well to think beyond what you can imagine. Um, yeah, that's kind of like where I'm at now in terms of thinking rehearsal, and thinking politically. How can we open ourselves up to being made not irrelevant, but being made no longer radical because someone's taken it beyond you and found that other breakage that we couldn't even imagine. So I guess that's a return to rehearsal as also a space of like deep, deep collective community work.
That is so important to mention. Thank you for saying that because you're right. This is collaborative. This is not us doing things on our own. This is having conversations. This is working with different people. This is letting, like, as you said, other people take something that you have done or a portal and going beyond what you could have imagined. Yes, I think that this is something that has come up in queer theory and queer spaces, they sort of become a norm, a new norm, and they no longer serve the purpose that, for newer generations. And so I really appreciate that this reflexivity on, yeah, sometimes we will become limited and we have to follow other leaders and learn to follow. And that's super important because this is collaborative work. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah.
Um, I will ask Ivana's question because I think it's important. Is there one or two people, events, and or venues that students studying dance histories should know about?
This is a hard question for me actually because I've been really because especially within disability like arts, right? Because we're doing a lot of work to a lot of folks are doing a lot of folks beyond me are doing work to reveal histories that have always been there. Um, at the same time, I'm also thinking about how to think time differently in the idea of like to understand history is not just to look at who's the past, but also I'm thinking of like who is here doing work now. And so to answer this now would be incomplete because there are so many folks who are doing important work right now. Um, but who can I think of on the top of my head about, oh, what? I don't have the answer for you right now because I think there's an element where I'm not sure if there's any one or two people I can think of that people need to know. Um, and I'm also kind of want to push back against the idea of like a singular figure, right? Of like historical figure. Um, and I'm thinking more about like there's a lot of disabled and mad and deaf and neurodivergent artists creating work. Like look at a festival, a dance festival, and find in the program where disabled artists are creating work and watch them and engage with them. Because I think that's the more important thing is where are they appearing, and who's appearing, and like as opposed to trying to find a singular figure. Exploring the collective of folks who are doing the work, and usually they're actually all interconnected because they are already engaging collectively. So if I had more time, I could think of like a long. I think the reason I can't answer the question is because I have a long list of people. Even when I named some people, I missed a lot of people, and feel bad now about naming some and not naming others, but it's the kind of thing where it's like, I don't think there's a single person.
Great. I love that honest answer, and I agree with you. And I really like that directive to go and look at a festival and see who's performing and engage with that work. I really appreciate that. Um, Thank you so much for joining us today. I've really had such a great time talking with you. It's provoked so many thoughts, and yeah, I'm so thankful. People, I see like the hands, the thank you hands, emojis. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you for having me.